quiet backwater in central South America, the landlocked country of Paraguay had, by the early 1990s, become a mecca for travellers with a love of old trains. Word had spread of imminent closure of its unique railway, which had to be seen to be believed. Not only did it have the world's slowest international train, but also the only one still powered by wood-burning steam engines. These handsome, tall-chimneyed Edwardian machines were supplied by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow in 1910. When we filmed them in 1991, they were still in charge of the weekly mail train from the Argentine border at Encarnacion to the capital, Asuncion. Some original rolling stock survived too, including this traditional American-style wooden baggage car. By the time she had cleared the station, old number 101 had reached full Paraguayan express speed, about 25 kilometers an hour. This was the secret of the locomotive's longevity. By driving them to and fro across the central grasslands at snail's pace for 85 years, the Paraguayans hadn't yet worn them out. Well, not quite. The relaxed timetable allowed the train 15 hours to cover the 372 kilometers to Asuncion, but it was usually late. The locals were never afraid of missing it. A gentle canter down the track would always enable them to catch it at the next station. With the 80-year-old train trundling off on its weekly run to the capital, it's worth pausing to consider the background of a country whose easy-going populace seemed resigned to such a backward railway. In the 17th century, when the Spanish Empire in South America was at its height, the landlocked province of Paraguay was a dependency of Argentina and consisted of little more than a string of river trading posts 2 weeks by boat from the Plate estuary. These ruins in the central grasslands between the rivers are the legacy of the Jesuit missionaries, whose native settlements produced tobacco and crops for the traders. The missions prospered and fine buildings rose from the pampa, but the Jesuits became so powerful they challenged the authority of the state and were expelled in the late 18th century. They left behind a vacuum of poverty and isolation, which independence in 1811 did little to improve. A railway was then promoted to open up the country, and in 1861 service duly commenced on a short section from the capital using this tiny engine called Sapucai. A disastrous war with Brazil then left the nation bankrupt, and progress on the railway ground to a halt. The then President Carlos Antonio Lopez was responsible for these misfortunes, but is nonetheless fondly remembered on the sides of the engines, which also carried the plates of the British company, the Central of Paraguay, who eventually completed the line in 1910. But the Plate River system, navigable by ships up to 12-foot draft, retained the lion's share of this small country's trade, leaving the railway with little to sustain it apart from mail and perishables. Timber was also carried, though most of it was fuel for the locomotives, not revenue freight. The railway may have lifted the interior out of obscurity, but it was always a loss maker and never paid a dividend to its shareholders. In Encarnacion yard, another Edwardian locomotive still in service was number 521, a 280 bought second-hand from Argentina. She was being loaded up with wood, Paraguay's only locally available fuel. The railway wasn't the only consumer of wood. The local kilns, too, were fired by wood furnaces, giving this small industrial state a pleasantly bucolic atmosphere. The logs came from a nearby sawmill, where we found a wood-fired, of course, steam crane from the Grafton Engineering Works in Bedford, England. At the locomotive shed, number 521 was being prepared for an overnight freight to Asuncion, a task which occupied the staff for most of the morning. A vital load for the trip consisted of the train crew's boxes containing food and clothing for a 4 or 5 day trip away from home. Outside on the turntable was number 226, a handsome 10-wheeler, also second-hand from Argentina. She was an ex-Urquiza Railway N-class and, like most of the other engines here, built in 1910. "226's task was to go to the Argentine border to collect wagons for number 521's freight train to the capital. Why 521 couldn't fetch its own wagons wasn't clear, but the pleasure of seeing two woodburners working at the same time outweighed any concerns over cost effectiveness, at least for your producer. The link from the border passed right through the town of Encarnacion. Number 226 clattered down the main street, back to the yard where number 521 was waiting. The long train of container flat cars from Argentina marked an increase in traffic since a new bridge over the border had replaced a river ferry in 1990. At 4 in the afternoon, number 521 finally pulled out for the long overnight haul to Asuncion. Once out on the main line, speed was even slower than the passenger train, and the cattle grazing peacefully on the overgrown trackbed weren't in the least bit concerned at the rumble of an approaching train. They knew there was plenty of time to get out of the way. At the wayside station of Carmen, there was plenty of time too for the station master to use his state-of-the-art 1910 telegraph to send Morse code signals down the line to advise of the train's progress, or lack of it. While the main line barely saw as much as one train a day, the 3-kilometre link from Encarnacion to the Argentine border was very busy by comparison. This was due to a sharp grade just outside the town, where old 226 could only manage 2 wagons at a time. So it took most of the morning to make up one freight train. Hopelessly uneconomic, of course, but pure heaven for the dedicated train watcher who could see 226 thundering down the main street several times in a morning. Passing behind the train was one of the new buses from Argentina, which had stolen most of the railway's cross-border passengers in the year since the opening of the new international bridge. These disused rails led to the old ferry station at Papukua. The new bridge across the Parana River to Argentina had now made the ferry redundant, but the station remained, complete with its now abandoned customs post. The cable incline to the slipway was still there too. Moored alongside with nothing to do, the steam ferry rusted quietly away. We shall now turn the clock back to the 1970s, thanks to Michael Cunningham, who captured these images in the capital Asuncion in busier times. The international train still consisted of the original varnished wooden stock, here being shunted into the fine Gothic-style station which dated from 1864. Locomotives in service at the time included this 260, one of a pair built as late as 1953 by the Yorkshire Engine Company. More or less a copy of the North British 1910 locos, it was one of the world's last saturated steam engines ever built, and was the Yorkshire Company's last steam order. A superheater would have made the loco heavier and slightly more expensive. By 1980, the station tracks had been bisected by a new road, which made operation very awkward in the final years of the service. The station building has now been turned into a museum. Just as in Encarnacion, street running was standard form here. Even at the prevailing low speeds, the locomotives had a voracious appetite for wood, so the sedate trip through Misiones province was anything but leisurely for the locomotive crew. En route to Encarnacion, the line crossed several rivers on flimsy bridges. It was these weak structures and the light 60-pound per yard rail, worn in places down to 50, that enforced the permanent 25 km/h speed limit on the whole railway. Returning now to the southern end of the line by the Parana River at Encarnacion, the story is taken up by Manfred Stolz, who captured these excellent scenes of the Papukua steam ferry in 1980. On the far side of the river is the Argentine city of Posadas, northern terminus of the standard gauge General Urquiza Railway. The central of Paraguay was originally broad gauge, but was converted to standard in 1910 in readiness for connection with a train ferry. That's why so many of the locomotives are all supplied in that year. This paddle steamer started work here in 1911 and remained for the whole 79 years of the service, sharing it with a sister vessel delivered in 1913. The weekly rail journey from Buenos Aires to Asuncion took 2.5 days, while a riverboat with comforts such as cabin and restaurant and a twice-a-week service took just over 3 days. Small wonder then that most through travellers preferred the boat. A policeman in the foreground could be seen warning a tourist that photography of this strategic installation was strictly forbidden. Meanwhile, Stolz had left his camera on a tripod unattended and fortunately unnoticed, thereby recording this classic scene. Passengers remained on board throughout this laborious procedure, while the obvious hazards apparently did not deter local food vendors from peddling their wares. The varnished wooden coaches we saw just 3 years before in the capital had now given way to modern coaches leased from Argentina, who proudly named their train El Gran Capitan. Next to the station was the steam winding engine that powered the cables on the slipway. Again, this was original equipment still in use. Meanwhile, engine number 5, a 262 tank built in England by Hawthorne Leslie in 1913, was leaving the loco shed. She was on her way to Pacacua to assist the newly arrived train from Argentina up the steep slope from the ferry to the town. In tandem with the train engine, number 226, number 5 put up a grand show on the 1 kilometre bank, almost the only place on the whole system where the engines had to work really hard. The surge in traffic from the opening of the bridge in 1990 should have been a blessing for the railway, but sadly, with its poor infrastructure, it was in no fit state to benefit. The brave but short-lived effort to haul more containers merely increased the wear and tear on the engines and the fragile 60-pound rail. Meanwhile, the Argentine tracks, which had now reached Paraguayan soil, had brought with them a container transfer yard. A boon for the road hauliers, but a bad omen for the railway. The Central of Paraguay didn't give up that easily. As late as 1994, the passenger train with its through coach for Buenos Aires doggedly continued its weekly visits to Encarnacion, lurching into the yard on unballasted rails which were no longer maintained, if only because it was increasingly hard to find them as they sank deeper into the ground. Right up to the end, station, locomotive and baggage car were all unchanged since the line first opened. Only the 1970s Argentine coaches reminded the locals they weren't living in a complete time warp. But to them this was all quite normal, as they disembarked from a train which had taken 18 hours for a trip which a bus could do in 6. To look at this scene, you wouldn't think road transport existed. The railway was still the official carrier for the state postal service, including overseas airmail, which had spent twice as long in the train as it had in the air. With her maximum permitted load of 2 vehicles, number 226 stomped up the bank to the Parana Bridge with the one remaining through coach for Buenos Aires, still maintaining the international connection. In just over a year, the new line to the border bridge had become almost as derelict as the old one to Pakakua, here in the foreground. The final straw for the Paraguay Central was the need to reroute part of it to accommodate a new flood barrage. But the cost couldn't be justified in view of competition not only from the road, but also from efficient container vessels on the Paraguay River. The end was brutal. In 1998, all remaining freight traffic was cancelled, and half the rails torn up to be sold as scrap to pay off the deficit. Nowadays, a weekend tourist train makes a short picnic run out of Asuncion. And amazingly, 2 woodburners survive at Encarnacion in revenue service, shunting the rail-to-road container terminal by the Parana Bridge. So these lucky few get to celebrate their centenary, while most of their stablemates have now followed the life-expired rails of the main line to the scrapyard.